Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Iowa, the place, the transmission zone, Iowa Catholic Radio. Also, if you listen to Iowa Catholic Radio on the internet at iowacatholicradio.com, Iowa Catholic Radio app, and of course, our lovely, beautiful, scholarly podcast listeners. We're so happy to have you here on the show. As I said, The Uncommon Good, I'm Bo Bonner. I'm Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing over at Mercy College. Bud, how do you spend your days?
I like to just say academic dean because Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences is always a mouthful for some reason. So,
where at? Can you tell us?
At Mercy College of Health Sciences in the heart of Des Moines.
Interesting enough, Bud, that same place where you and I work underwrites this show. Mercy College of Health Sciences. Thank you for underwriting The Uncommon Good. mchs.edu. Always able to go check out what is going on as the college tries to further the healing ministry of Jesus Christ, brought here from Ireland by the Sisters of Mercy, and hopefully we are doing our part continuing that healing ministry here at the school and all the places that the students end up, mchs.edu.
Yeah, in my role, I was walking around this morning. I visited one of our nursing labs, and they were doing wound care. And when I think about a career in the medical profession, you know, sometimes I wonder, like, could I memorize all the Latin terms that need to be memorized? But I think the wound care might be the thing that really tripped me up eventually.
You don't think you would be able to either stomach it or memorize it?
Stomach, the former. It looked pretty intense. So, but I'm a father of 8, so I might want to get used to tending a wound before it's all said and done.
I think the closest I ever got to something like that is I wanted to have like an alternative band in the 90s, and I could see us calling that band Wound Care. That sounds like a 90s band, but it has absolutely nothing with helping people. Probably not even the music, because we weren't that good. So the Lord knows what he's doing after all, as the Garth Brooks song says. But if you feel like maybe you have a vocation to wound care or other healing ministries, mchs.edu, Mercy College of Health Sciences, thank you for underwriting the show. Bud, we are still friends after spending a lot of time together recently. People might be, what are you talking about? But we had the great fortune to go be at the Notre Dame De Nicola Ethics Conference, where we got to speak on a panel. So not only did we get to drive back and forth, have a lot of time to talk, had a panel with the wonderful Sisters of the Little Way. The panel, I think, went great. But I will say one of the most frightening things, other than hearing our good friend Charlie Camosi and Jeff Bishop talk about changing definitions of personhood in relationship to things like brain death and biomedical futures, is when we were driving back, the sun was completely setting like at 4 p.m. coming out of Chicago, and that's frightening.
Oh, it's terrible. What's the rationale for that? I've heard different things, like they don't want kids to go into school in the dark, but by the time you get done with your workday and go home, there's nothing left.
See, my wife and I were getting into this big discussion is, are we in daylight savings time or are we out of daylight savings time?
I can't keep up with that. And then
Robin says whatever. She just wants what we had before we fell back.
If you set up an announcement or write someone an email and you have to reference the time, do you ever do, like, for the show, say the person's in New York or on the East Coast? I just always do CT Central Time, but I think during a certain part of the year, you're supposed to do CST.
Yes.
Central Savings Time.
I just add random letters like CZT, so they think that the time is particularly special or something. I'm with you. I never keep this straight. So I kind of think there's a groundswell of just leaving it alone, whatever it might be. So maybe that's the key. We never talk about politics because we don't want it to get bogged down into polarization. But I'm just going to throw out there for all those candidates, I think this is the year that if you ran on getting rid of the switch, you could probably get a few extra votes.
I voted last week, and I kept doing an internet search to see which city council members were going to chuck daylight savings time. It wasn't on anyone's platform.
Oh man, people don't have their pulse on America like they
Unions
used to.
need to fight this. Labor rights and daylight savings time.
Daylight savings time. Well, speaking of saving time, we're going to go to the break, and when we come back, we're going to go on with our radio reading roundup. John Henry Newman talking about his sermons. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are doing once more the radio reading roundup with John Henry Newman. We have got to the point, Bud, where we're reading his sermons, something that, as we said before, he is a master at. Now, last time that we were doing the sermons, we stuck to one, probably one of our favorites, and it was the one that went right out of the gate talking about holiness. So we've this time tried to read a few. And what's interesting, I forget which volume within the Plano Parochial Sermons is this? Is this volume 2 or 3?
Right now?
Yeah, that we're going to do.
Oh, man, you put me on the spot.
Okay, whichever one it is.
I want to say 2.
What's interesting about it in total, it's volume 2. Okay, cool. You start to see how his mind works thematically and liturgically.
Yeah.
So this comes in a whole, I would say, suite of sermons that are about the apostles. And a lot of it has to do with other sermons that are like virtues that you should have in order to be saintly. So he has sermons called like the Kingdom of Saints or All Saints' Day sermons about Christian zeal, things like this. What we wanted to center on is 3 interesting ones in a row, 2 that have to be about dangers, he says. So we're entering the Newman danger zone. And one is about the power of angels. They can all seem like they're going over the place. One's the danger of riches. One is about natural power. The other is the danger of accomplishments. But all of them are actually grounded in either saints or angels. So we're going to talk about St. Matthew with the danger of riches, the angels themselves when talking about natural powers, and then the dangers of accomplishments with St. Luke. That's the order they appear in. So, Bud, let's start with the danger zone, the Newman danger zone. What I am most impressed about, so for instance, let's just talk about the dangers of riches first. He, of course, hits, I don't know how to say this, what you would expect in some ways, right? He's just hitting the Bible verses in some way, all of them that talk about the danger of riches. Fundamental, right, is that money is the root of all evil. Going on from there, New Testament, parasopes about where you put your treasure, so is your heart, things like this. But the way that he's able to both tease out complications, but also sort of, I don't want to say wrap it up or summarize it, but have those observations sort of orbit around 2 nexuses, I don't know how you say that.
Know.
Really impresses me. Because in the end, he's going to talk about 2 distinct things, that riches are dangerous in the having of them, but then he's also going to talk about the dangers of pursuing them. In the meantime, though, he hits all sorts of incredibly important and nuanced notes on this. Masterful sermonic work, just coming out of the gate with something that you kind of could guess what he was going to say, but I still think he draws out, just in the form of how he talks about it, things that I wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Yeah, I think what surprised me the first time I came across this sermon is what you've hit on, that a lot of times when there's Christian preaching about wealth, it has to do with like the love of riches. And I've even had some friends who distinguish between, they say like, well, what Christ condemned was mammon and not money itself. So there's, people make arguments about this kind of like specificity to that specific term. Mammon would be like unjustly gained wealth or wealth that you cling to. But Newman, he doesn't really pull any punches here. I think, the verse that he focuses on is like, the rich have already received their consolation. Mm-hmm. And so he really hits home this idea that like, if you build your life around wealth, you already have your reward.
Well, and I was going to ask you about that. Am I overreading it? Is he, at least, I'm not saying that he's in an Oxford dictionary sort of sense, but in this sermon, do you feel like he's trying to make a distinction between consolation and comfort? Because he brings up multiple verses about like the rich man and Lazarus, about who, in this life you had many things, but now he's comforted in heaven. So maybe it was just a trick of the language, but to me, I think rhetorically he was trying to say riches might be your consolations now, but comfort, which is a word again, I'm thinking of the 19th century, of course. When we think of comforts, we're like, my fluffy pillow and my satin overcoat or whatever. He really is talking about comfort. And I mean, I think he's breaking it apart, right? This being with someone, in their need and applying yourself to it. So I don't know if I'm overreading that, but I think he's getting at this idea, like you said. It's not only that you will if you have riches, you're getting your reward now, but that all they can do is sort of be with you in the here and now and will disappear. But true comfort is something that only poverty, at least a poverty of spirit, allows us to have.
Yeah, there might be that there. When you started to dive into that conversation about comfort, there's another sermon where Newman really rails against comfort. And he talks about these like fineries, like soft raiments and a stocked pantry. Mm-hmm. Sort of, you get this idea of like the gentleman sitting by his fireplace in a leather chair with the finest tobaccos. So he said, but that ties into this sermon because for Newman, one of the main dangers of riches is that they have this alluring quality that can dupe us into turning them into a god. Mm-hmm. So we've talked on the show about the philosophical movement, utilitarianism, and as Catholics, we shouldn't think in a utilitarian way about bioethics and things. But there is another sense of that term. I know we're like doing all these like verbal definitions here today, but there's another sense of that term where properly applied to money, it's actually a good and accurate way of describing it. So I think what Newman is saying in part of this sermon is that money has a utilitarian function, mm-hmm. and he knows we can't extract ourselves from society and avoid it altogether. But he says there's a really seductive way in which it turns into something else. So not something that's merely functional, where I have to put bread on my table, but where it becomes a god to us, because he says it gives us this sense of power, like we're kind of in control of the direction of our own lives. And, paradoxically, or like the danger here in part is that it's visible to us, so we can kind of like check how much is in our banking account, or we can see what we've bought with our money, and we kind of gather all these things around us, and it sort of weakens or corrodes our trust in God.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because there are things that should be merely utility, and money's one of them. We actually sort of get it all the way back around. We will, so to speak, engage in religion as long as it's useful to us, but treat money as if it's stable and, like you said, like it's the god of our lives. I thought you were going to start singing Sarah McLachlan and hope you find some comfort here. But clearly, there's Sarah McLachlan comfort, and then there's, like you said, like the niceties of the rich gentleman that he's railing against. Here, he's trying to say, oh, no, that whatever, I mean, I think that's like a sort of commentary on where you put your treasure, so is your heart, is that you can have a comfort that is heavenly comfort and perpetual and everlasting, or you can have the consolation of the comforts that will quickly go away. A phrase how he puts it is he talks about having means, and I think that's a good way to talk about the ontological problem of relying on money like he's talking about. Is it sure can, it's not only that you serve it as a god, which, again, I think a lot of people rail on. Newman is saying that because, it's not, we can avoid precarity, at least at the moment, right? If I have enough in my bank account, if I have a steady job, if I have a house, it sure seems like my life isn't, have any precarity to it. It's going to be there tomorrow. The sun will rise. I'll have a job. I'll be able to provide for my family. Not only is this just untrue, because it can all go away tomorrow, the fortunes of any nation can radically change, your life can be impacted in ways that you don't know, but at the heart of the religious aspect of it, it's just simply not true that the sort of reliability that you feel in your life stems from that stuff. Because on one hand, God himself, in a special act of grace or punishment, however you take it, could take it all away if he just wanted to. But even more so, all of existence is held in its vitality because of God. And so to act like there's anything on earth that are the means that can make you feel secure, even if you don't entirely mean it. And he will go on this in one paragraph, is you can be perfectly religious otherwise, but But if at root you believe you are in a stable position because of the riches that you have, it doesn't even have to be like your Scrooge McDuck swimming through gold. It's at the heart of things. Do you think that you are fine and good to go because of the riches you've accumulated? Or do you have at the heart of things that even all of that can go away, but of course life and existence can go away unless we learn to trust in God?
Yeah, when I read sermons like this one, I'm struck by how keen Newman's sense of human psychology is. And I think it really came from his pastoral ministry. So there's a way you could study Newman and read all of his published works, and you get this kind of corpus of theological discussions, like the key pillars of the faith, where he talks about ecclesiology and justification on down the line. But if you read about his life, and it's interesting to take his works and read it against the backdrop of his life, because he's always writing from an occasional situation. What I mean is he's spurred to write. He's never thinking like, what's the next book that I have to put on my CV? Mm-hmm. He's always the spark always comes from some argument that he has, basically, or some event that takes place. So we don't have to get too much into it, but when he was a young kid, he was converted to evangelicalism, and he embraced sort of like the English version of evangelical Protestantism, which emphasized this kind of like personal commitment to Jesus, had sort of an emphasis on a focus on the cross as like this would be the centerpiece of our sort of spirituality. And then in some ways, Newman's faith was always a little bit dry in a good sense of the term, but like maybe a sense on like, well, our emotions should follow our beliefs, etc. And he walks away from this after he's appointed as a minister in the Church of England, because it's in his conversations with his parishioners that he says, like, this system that I have adopted doesn't map onto their actual spiritual lives. And this is when he first actually starts to contemplate the use of like sacramental confession. He's like, wow, why has most of Anglicanism abandoned this? Because the minister should be a spiritual healer. Mm-hmm. And, these are individuals who have been baptized from birth or whatnot, but they still like they're struggling and they're working their way towards God. And so I say all that, I think it's in his conversations with parishioners and things where he really gets a sense of like kind of the excuses that people can make about clinging to the riches. That's where he says like, well, we tend to talk about the love of these things, but sometimes it really goes down to like the possession of wealth. And then second, he also recognizes like I guess I don't feel like I'm a very nimble thinker, and Newman so much is. And like in each paragraph you can see, he's like, look, when Jesus first made these statements, it was shocking to the apostles. Like they were not operating with that mindset. So, it's the first like our Lord shots fired sort of situation. And Newman knows some people in the pews are going to be thinking similar things.
I thought you were going to say, knowing Newman studies, I thought you guys had figured out like, well, like earlier that week, Earl owed him money and had, no, I'm kidding.
It might get down to that.
No, I'm joking. One thing that I would head off at the pass before we get into the second, so we're talking about the possession of money, we'll talk about the desire in a second. So, I mean, I'm unfortunate at least how he put some of this, but I actually think there's a theological point behind it. You might hear him say like, oh, something to the effect of, instead of living according to the Gospels, they live according to Judaism or like the Jewish way of understanding things. I'm not going to act like John Henry Newman is not a British person in the 19th century, and that probably has a barb of at least popular anti-Semitism to it. But what I will say is, to be very specific, what I know he's getting at is what I think we would call, Bud, the Deuteronomical. Is that the right way to say it? Like Deuteronomy-esque interpretations.
I didn't know if you were saying deuterocanonical.
No, Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomical.
Deuteronomy, yeah. Which, to be fair, I think there's some people who might say that's sort of a code word for maybe some sort of anti-Semitic readings of the Old Testament. But I think it's fair to say in the Old Testament itself, there are, of course, rival interpretations, all of them having a grain of truth, many of them sort of fighting against each other. I don't think there's a way to get around that. Like, so Job himself is sort of taking to task an overread of some of the Proverbs, for instance, where clearly the prophets, right, are at least being inventive of their interpretation of the Davidic kingdom. So to read the Old Testament is to have an interhuman Hebraic discussion, right, where they all don't agree, and of course Jesus comes by and has his definitive read on all this.
Yeah, and I want to throw in there, it's rooted, as you say, in Deuteronomy, because when Moses gives his sort of like win one for the Gipper speech, like his pep talk, he says to the people of Israel, choose life or death. Like there's two paths. There's the path of life or the path of death. And what you're saying, which is really true, is like there became an interpretation that was a little wooden, where if you, like, you know, we all know the verse from Proverbs, like, raise up your children the way they should go, and in their older days, they'll honor you.
Yes.
And then we know, like, oh, there's these amazing parents who end up with hellion children.
Yep.
And so that's where you're saying, like, books like Job push back and say, like, life is a little more complex than that sometimes.
And so clearly Newman has that, because look, especially coming from the evangelical circles, and certainly prosperity gospel and things like we're dealing with in the here and now, have their root in earlier evangelical movements, especially in Britain, where there is this sort of, I mean, I don't want to, again, Phariseeism is maybe like being too easy if a shot's fired, but there's certainly this idea that if you just live a good Christian life and follow these rules, God will bless you now. And so there's what he's getting at in this is saying some of the way that you deal with how you all deal with riches is you're actually only being moral because you think it has good payout in this life. He then says that this has something to do with Judaism in general, which again I said not ultimately defensible. Certainly wish he'd use different words. I just don't want it to be, if you're reading this, you come across that and think Newman is just being anti-Semitic for the fun of it. That really is, go to a side about like the words he's using. As someone who grew up evangelical, there is certainly that sort of what would be called sort of an Ebonitism from early on, that, and even a Pelagianism. You do these things, you get these rewards. Yeah. And so I think what is much more proper to say is something like either the interpretation of the Old Testament, where Deuteronomy and Proverbs above all, and Newman is trying to say whatever else is true, Jesus Christ at least complicated that, if not sided more with the prophets per se.
Yeah, and for myself, there's so much to say from this sermon, but one of the passages that are excerpts that I found the most convicting, it really builds on what we were talking about earlier with the visibility of riches and their accessibility to us. But Newman, as the sermon goes on, he starts to cultivate this idea about, like, how do we develop a proper spiritual sense, like a kind of way of looking at the world that's in line with the gospel. And he goes into this sort of tirade, or like he starts to really criticize an over-dependency or a constant kind of engagement in what he calls amusements. Mm-hmm. Like, funny enough, the launch pad is game hunting.
Yeah.
But I thought about this in my own life because we've talked about it on the show before. I love college football. In fact, this time of year, I can spend a lot of time watching football. But this is a word of warning, I think, even for those of us who aren't like Scrooge McDuck, like rolling in our dough. He says, hence the mischief of many amusements of what is called the fashion of the day, which are devised for the very purpose of taking up our thoughts and making the time pass away. Quite contrary is the Christian temper, which is in its perfect and peculiar enjoyment when engaged in that ordinary, unvaried course of duties which God assigns to us, in which the world calls dull and tiresome. So he says, like, you know, I think this is applicable to a lot of us. You don't need that much money before you can, like, spend most of your life structuring it in such a way where you're just distracting your thoughts, and it makes the time pass more easily. As an alternative to that, he presents, it really reminded me of like St. Theresa's little way, where what we tend to try to slough off is what the world calls dull and tiresome, but they're really providentially these duties that God has brought before us to sharpen our minds and to focus our attention on the world to come.
No, I think that and what's interesting about that is, on one hand, this will get into the next sermon talking about, what is it?
The danger of accomplishments.
Accomplishments, yes. Yeah. So he's going to talk about the finer things there. This is, again, why he's a masterful sermon writer, is so he gets into, look, if you're just trying to dissipate your mind and distract yourself through experiences, which is one of the things wealth does, you're not going to be centered and mindful and contemplative about, you know, heaven and live your life as you should as a Christian. But then he goes, look, but all of that makes somewhat sense, right? Because like we're just creatures and we're living this life and you get bored. He goes, what's insane is that there's some people who will actually throw those experiences aside just to gain more wealth. And he goes, that sort of love of gain just for the sake of gain is even less explicable for a Christian. He goes, it's one thing to be a human who, wants to bide the time so you get riches so that you can entertain yourself. To actually throw those aside, not for the sake of the kingdom, not for the sake of being simple, but just to gain money. He goes, is the inverse, as it were, of the Christian life. So I think we could talk on for this one, but we're going to hit the break and then move on to some of the other sermons. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Be that how it may, whether it is over iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, all of our towers emitting radio signals throughout the land of Iowa and maybe beyond, depending on what the clouds are doing, but also all of our wonderful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. We are rolling along with our radio reading roundup, John Henry Newman, the sermons, and Bud. We're on a roll here. We just got done talking about the danger of riches. We're going to try to hit 2 more sermons here. We'll see if we can do it and behave. All of them sort of talking about saints that brought up certain aspects of the good life. So St. Matthew, we didn't talk about him too much in the first segment, but that's what was being implied. It was taken from St. Matthew. Here, Newman is going to talk about the danger of accomplishments and talk about St. Luke. And this one's a lot more interesting because he really does focus on the fact that St. Luke, the only gospel writer who is not Jewish, but also is quite assuredly, at least by tradition, trained in the liberal arts. He's assigned to be an artist. People think he's a physician. He does mention that St. Paul obviously trained in rhetorical arts as well. But so he sort of talks about the mystery of God, who mostly, right, in making his gospels and things like this, as Jesus chooses fishermen, people of low account, right, to make sure that the humble overthrow the thrones of the strong. But he goes, God has a place for people like St. Luke, and St. Luke is this great example of using his elegant education for good. But Newman, in this one, but I think you've talked before about personal matters really reflecting in Newman's sermons. I think the Oxford-trained guy wants to talk about the dangers specifically laser-focused at his class, his type of people, what he maybe sees himself being tempted to by the accomplishments. And by accomplishments, he almost completely here means learning. Yeah. The liberal arts and the elegant and polite education that he got at Oxford.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting sermon for me. It's one, even during the break, we were like teasing out points from the sermon. But there's a way you could read this text as kind of poo-pooing liberal education, which is fascinating because Newman went on to help found a university in Ireland and wrote some very important, the idea of a university, what would you call those, addresses on basically the liberal arts and higher education, which are still used today. He also has some shots fired at novels and then went on to write 2 of them himself. So this is one where I think if you do a surface level reading, you might mistake what Newman is saying. But once you drill down a little bit deeper, there's some really interesting points. So I'll start with the novels, I guess. That one's a little easier for me to grab a hold of. But when he discusses these, he says like a novel is kind of a refined education where you gain a lot of head knowledge and you engage things at that level. It can even excite feelings. So if it's well written, it can move our emotions and things. But he says the real trouble here is that a lot of times folks will read novels and they'll have this like cathartic experience and they think like weirdly in their minds they've sort of done something. But he says like really there's a way to read or even to study where you divorce feeling and action. The payoff phrase here is he says at one point, God has made us to feel in order that we may go on to act in consequence of feeling. If then we allow our feelings to be excited without acting upon them, we do mischief to the moral system within us, just as we might spoil a watch. I see this today, I don't want to in talking about this, I don't want to act like I transcend the dynamic. You see this sometimes on social media where with like our avatars or our profile pics, you'll like assign some image that is connected to the latest cause that's being talked about. I go back to, what was it? The Arab Spring.
Yes.
And there were these revolts and things taking place, some protests in Egypt and different places. And everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of those who I follow, like turn their avatar like a green shade. And I remember a friend even writing something like the revelation. How many words were used, or how many characters? 145.
Yeah, right. 144, I think.
Yeah, like the revolution will be in 144 characters or something like that.
Right,
and
right.
so there's a way, for me, I think it's really films. Like you watch a really moving film, whether it's The Passion of the Christ, or there's a great one about, we watched together. What's the one about Not a Beautiful Life?
I'm really worried. We've watched a lot of different movies together.
It will come back to me, but like for me with movies, that's where I experience the most catharsis. And you'll watch something about like a terrible series of events, and your heart is genuinely broken. But like, you know, you go to bed that night. Where has that brought you?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and like what I like to call that, I've termed a new thing. It's the therapeutic use of other humans' misery, which is morally horrendous, right? To sort of think you've done something because you've had feelings on social media that other people you know will also congratulate you for having. That's a whole other episode for something else. But I do think that's what Newman's after. And, you know, I think people can change or they refine how they say things. Newman himself here says things like the arts or novels or literature itself, they're good as long as you don't pursue them for their own sake. In the idea of the university, his whole thing is about knowledge for its own sake. So I don't think that this is like the damning evidence that it might come off as first. Like you said, there's a lot of years between these sermons and idea, if I'm not mistaken, right? On one hand. So he could have changed his mind. I think what's clear from this is actually what he is ultimately getting at, if I can correct a saint and maybe future doctor of the church, is what he means is for the own sake of the emotional or feelings or passionate response, because that's what he's getting at. He goes, look, if you're into reading novels, we would say watching movies, but even great literature, even these great works, if what you're doing them for is the emotional high or the good feelings you get for them, the cathartic nature like you were talking about, and you can get in these big arguments as catharsis about purging bad emotions, in which case it is just about using the arts for your own sake, or is it about purifying them, right? Is it about trying to bring them to a better place? When you get to this idea, it really is about utilitarian uses of higher learning. He doesn't put it that way yet. And to me, this is one of those interesting things, but that in a sermon, talking with, you know, the people at the pews, right, at the most basic levels, to Idea of University, which is a treatise, the sort of growth, I actually, to connect this back to development of doctrine, actually, I see all of this as in continuity. This is the seed he plants, talking to people of his flock, that eventually becomes the idea of the university. Because the problem, once again, the danger of all this is to be utilitous about something that it's good in itself. We were talking before we were jumping back on here about, he brings up the tabernacle, and to be fair, it is a little ambiguous, but I think if you really bear down, he's trying to say, look, there's all sorts of elegant art forms like, you know, making gold or, you know, rendering things in images. And a lot of people would think of those as the sort of refinement that bring people astray. But then he goes, look at the tabernacle. All of those sort of fine, polite, delicate arts were used for the glory of God. So Newman, of all people, is not saying you need to be a man and dig ditches and fight wars, right? This is not sort of like bro country or, you know, hyper-masculine Christianity that Newman's after. He's trying to say that if all of these things are done for the sake of the feeling you get, I'm better than other people, I enjoy novels and it makes me have the feels, but then I divorce it from action, that's what he's railing against. And it gets back to even what he says in the idea of the university, but you can form an intellect and you should do it for its own sake, but that's different than having a body that's healthy or a morality that's virtuous. Mm-hmm. So being smart can't make you virtuous. And I think that's what he ultimately means. What Christianity has done correctly, he says, is in spurring the liberal arts, at the same time, but not the same thing, not mixing them at the same time, but parallel is a formation of the moral life in things like prayer, fasting, alms, etc.
The movie I was thinking about, by the way, is A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick, which is about Blessed Franz Jagerstatter. I don't know, I had a brain freeze there, but a very different movie than A Beautiful Life.
Yes,
so I just had to say that on the radio. Yeah, so much to say here. You know what, the point that you're making about the elegant arts and how they can be misused, this is really a reminder, I think, to those who study philosophy or theology.
Okay, bud. Jeez, just call me out on air.
Yeah, sometimes you can study theology and think because it's the study of God that holiness is intrinsic, like it's baked into the experience, but not the case. And I think especially about my not twisted journey. That sounds wrong. The journey with many twists and turns,
right?
Through studying theology for
tortuous journey,
for
not torturous, tortuous,
like almost.
No, there's difference. Anyway, keep going.
Say it again.
Tortuitous.
Fortuitous?
No. There is a word that means like winding and twisting that looks like tortoise that I'm mangling on air.
I'm going to find that immediately after the show is over.
No, I'm looking now. Keep going.
But I studied theology for a decade and a half, and I think the real danger of studying theology in today's world is that it's primarily an academic pursuit. And, you know, when you and I were at Duke Divinity School, there were ways where they tried to nudge us towards prayer and spiritual direction, but it's not really part of the curricula. I don't want to cast the Middle Ages as like just pure unadulterated golden age of studying theology. But for the most part, because of the historical circumstances, those who did were living in community. They had a life of prayer. Mm-hmm. They were celebrating Mass. And so even in this way, the study of God is not an object in the world that we can study. Like we can say like, what's the anatomy of a frog, or how do comets burn out, etc. That's two very varied examples. But because God is a person properly understood, the creator of all, and love itself, you know, not simply like a powerful force in the universe, you can't do that study rightly or well without being immersed in a life of prayer. But that's sort of like an optional thing. And so that's where, even in the study of the most important topic that we know, you can have this divorce between feeling and action.
So just to show you an example of how education corrupts you, I'm going to read a dictionary definition on air. So the word I am talking about is tortuous, having or marked by repeated turns or bends, winding or twisting, not straightforward, circuitous, devious, highly involved, complex. So I think an apt description of what you're talking about with your life. The problem is I'm from Oklahoma and don't know how to pronounce words, so it is tortuous, not tortuous. But I thought you were saying torturous. Like, so that's being tortured. And so what I'm getting at, people, is
I think I was
grad school can ruin your brain.
Yeah, I was thinking about a journey with many twists and turns.
Yeah,
circuitous might have worked. Does circuitous mean coming back to the same point necessarily? Oh.
So
that's probably not the case, but I went with twisted. So, and in a way, like if you spend enough time in theological circles, you know, you see some things.
True. Well, the thing that I'll say is what is tortuous, but in a good way, is I think Newman, you see a sort of growth. Again, we can get into technical details. We know he read Aristotle, for instance. We know he read the Poetics and ideas about what art is supposed to do. It's absolutely the case, though, but what you were hitting so well is that if we do even liberal arts in community, a lot of what Newman is getting at goes away. So, for instance, Aristotle talking about, for instance, Sophocles, he's not saying you're a bookworm that reads that by yourself. That's actually a public liturgy almost, right, that all of the Greek cities would engage in. And this idea of together in community, having the right emotions, even towards like a fictional character, so as to have practice at future virtue. I think that's why it's important to start talking about even like the liberal arts programs. You know, Mortimer Adler, God rest his soul, he had many great ideas, many great books that he himself wrote. But he had this idea that if you just gave people like the 50 best books and like hand-delivered them to their door and read it, they'd be these capable American citizens with a deep sort of appreciation of the liberal arts. But everyone from John Sr. to other people said, like, Mortimer, that's not the case. If you don't have these communities, it's going to be exactly what Newman here is saying. It's just going to be refinement for the sake of the feeling of refinement, or even just the sort of feeling of the emotional release. And it's not going to be grounded, in practice, which even before you get to the Christian practice, it's the practice of an intellectual scholar. But then the other thing, Bud, of course, is it will probably make you think that, okay, wonder and awe, which is the thing that like a lot of the liberal arts folks rightfully are starting to talk about, are only contained to things like poems and literature, or maybe the humanities. You brought up frogs and comets. I actually think this is a great segue into the third and final one we're talking about, which is about natural powers and how the angels and angelic beings undergird the reality of the created order, maybe something we would see more in the natural sciences, which is wonderful as well, and not just technical and brutish and like mathematic.
Yeah, but before we move on to that sermon, there's just one. I just don't feel like you can discuss the danger of accomplishments without referencing this passage. And so sticking with that for one moment, it's really kind of interesting how Newman segues into this, because he says in books, there's always sort of like a positive spin, or everything is made beautiful in its own way. That novelists don't really spend a lot of time with the drudgery of life, because, well, unless you're Charles Dickens, maybe.
That's right.
But, like, who's going to read a book that's like, and then she washed the dishes or whatnot? And so it tends to either like excite feelings or focus on beautiful things. But there's this wonderful quotation from, it's near the end of the sermon. He's contrasting that with true faith. He says, true faith teaches us to do numberless disagreeable things for Christ's sake, to bear petty annoyances which we find written down in no book. In most books, Christian conduct is made grand, elevated, and splendid, so that anyone who only knows of true religion from books and not from actual endeavors to be religious is sure to be offended at religion when he actually comes upon it. It is beautiful and a picture to wash the disciples' feet, but the sands of the real desert have no luster in them to compensate for the servile nature of the occupation. And I don't know, I feel like the things that Newman touches on, like they could probably hit different people in different ways. For me, that really hit home. And even when I read about the saints, like, there's a way where you read the saints' lives and you're like, oh yeah, I could do that. That's neat. I'm sort of like right. St. Francis of Assisi. And Newman, in another sermon, he really drives home a similar point where he says, like, when you think about a life of holiness, like, don't start with martyrdom. That's we kind of create in our own minds, like, if I was thrust into a dangerous, difficult situation, I would make the right choice. He says, pay closer attention to how you're responding to those petty annoyances and that drudgery and the dutiful sort of like things that come up each day in our lives. And to me, that's much more difficult because it's something I can wrap my mind around. I can sort of get to the end of the day and say, how did I actually handle the petty annoyances? I wasn't brought before a court where like the possibility of like the guillotine was there, but was I like faithful in the things that God actually brought before me?
I even think that's maybe a way. I'm not acting like modern authors read Newman here, but there's a way in which the novel has evolved away from what he, I think, saw as frivolous. So that's even an interesting thing to think historically. The novel at the time, or at least many of the ones he's probably running into, I think certainly could be accused of what he's talking about. It's interesting to think about as time has progressed, we have, novels have in some ways like become obsessed with minutia, maybe answering some of what he says. So, criticisms of novels from even someone like Newman can make change. Maybe that's why he tried his hand at the novel even to make it, so to speak, more realistic. We're running out of time. We should have probably thought about this.
I've got a way to wrap it up, though.
Okay.
Because I've said it a couple times already, but I think Newman is challenging his congregation to develop a real spiritual sense or vision of the world. So, like, tying this back to the liberal arts, he doesn't get into this so much in his sermon on the powers of nature, but there's a way that you can study science and you can start to see the universe as like cogs and gears. And it's got an amazing explanatory power. We can say, like, this is the way things work. And then we turn around and do amazing things with that knowledge. Newman, we don't have time to get into it. The inspiration for this one is the Feast of St. Michael and all the angels. But he really gives like this beautiful reflection upon the spiritual powers that undergird the operations of all things, and how, as Christians, man, I'm sorry. I'm disappointed that we're out of time, because he's like, there's a way where we can fixate or obsess about angels, which is spiritually unhealthy.
Right.
But properly speaking, like developing a sort of awareness of your guardian angel, but certainly of like the host of angels, can give us a proper perspective as we journey throughout all of life.
And I think that the tying nature of all of these is, whether it's misusing angels or, like you said, being obsessed with them in the wrong way or ignoring them completely, whether it's the liberal arts and the sort of ways in which they tempt us to do these wrongs, when it goes back to riches, it really is about utilitarianism in the end. It's about not thinking that the world is this vast, dumb instrument for humans to use however they want and however they please. But how do we have that sort of reverence and gratitude that believes grace can even be intertwined in something like the historical natural processes of nature? Because he's not being like, science is stupid. He's saying do all of those studies, but the angels, even no matter what we learn, undergird all of that. Brilliant stuff. I'm glad that we've been able to talk about it. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we have sort of a short segment because there was too much good stuff to talk about with Newman and our radio reading roundup. We're going to keep that rolling. We should have some interviews interspersed in the next few weeks, just to let people know about that. But the next sermon we're going to do in the radio reading roundup, Bud, I throw it over to you to introduce.
So this is going to actually come from Newman's Catholic period. The work is called Sermons Preached on Various Occasions, and this is Sermon 6 from that book. Interestingly enough, we mentioned his work at the University of Ireland. This book is comprised of 8 sermons that were preached during his first year there. So the academic year, 1856, 1857, he's preaching before the community, the academic community, and he collected these as sermons preached on various occasions. Again, you can access all these at newmanreader.org. It's a great little resource for, hey, if you don't want to spend money on books this holiday season, you can just go straight to that website. All of Newman's printed works. Speaking of websites, we encourage you to go to Iowa. Is it iowacatholicradio.com?
Yes.
Easy to remember. Or use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray with us. You can pray the rosary using the app, or you can join us. We broadcast the rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., and then the Chaplet of Divine Mercy in the afternoon at 2:55 p.m.
iowacatholicradio.com. You have all the events that are going on in and around the Diocese of Des Moines, other dioceses adjacent to us, all of the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area. Excuse me. It's being Taylor Swift there.
Torturous to say that.
Booyah. So the one big event, folks, that you just need to have on your mind, December 8th, big one at Des Moines, starting at 6 at Embassy Suites downtown. Dinner in December with Dr. David Anders. Mass at the Cathedral at 5, cocktail hour at 6, the dinner at 7, Dr. Anders goes on at 8. And then after that, things start, that's the new year after that. So that's the one to really focus on, iowacatholicradio.com. And as always, we want to make sure people think about this ministry as not just the voices on air, the people behind the boards, or the people at the desks. It's your ministry as well. You make it happen through your prayers, through your donations. I know as we're approaching the end of the year, it's important to keep in mind maybe deductible tax donations, things like this. I know that we are still fervently asking to support Iowa Catholic Radio and all its endeavors. So much that it's doing, expanding its reach through the airwaves, doing digital marketing, things like this that are so imperative for us to be able to do all that we've been able to accomplish together. This is your ministry as well, so I hope you prayerfully consider donating here towards the end of the year. 515-223-1150 to text or call, or you can go on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app and donate. Bud, as always, Newman, we should never act like we can do 3 of his sermons in one take. We're silly people.
It's funny how the show works, though. We've been doing this for several years now, but I'm always nervous about having too much to talk about. You don't sweat it at all, and usually
you mean too little. You worry about having too little or too much.
Too little, yeah, of running out of things to talk about, I should say. You don't sweat it, and by the end of the show, we usually are like, oh, one more point.
Part 2 next week. But yeah,
To be
so
continued.
yeah, but no, we're looking forward to it, folks. This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.